Hey team, Mike here at After 40 Fitness. This is going to be part 2 of the Keto Myths montage. If you recall from part 1, I allocated 20 minutes to do the 10 myths and end up blowing the entire 20 minutes on the first 5. Number 1 being our non-calorie sweeteners, right? Aspartame, sucralose, as well as monk, stevia, erythritol, etc. Are they keto friendly? Are they fasting friendly? Right? Number 1 went right for the jugular on that one. How about number 2 was that calories don't matter or do matter, right? Which is it? Because we're hearing a lot more now in the low carb space that calories don't matter. Calories in, calories out is now irrelevant. Dealt with that myth as well. Number 3, oh my goodness, my favorite myth of all time is that too much protein is a problem. Too much protein can impact our glucose and or our fat levels. You know, this one's been just proven for the last decade, but oh my God, does dogma ever persist? Every day in social media, I see people saying, don't overeat protein. It'll spike gluconeogenesis. Just science goes out the window on this one. It really does.
Hey, I got you guys a protein shake.
Awesome. I love protein.
I know you love protein. I love protein too.
Number 4 was that there's a direct correlation between how much fat you eat and the level of cholesterol. That too much fat causes cholesterol to increase. Okay, dealt with that one. And lastly was that there are carbs that are essential. Well, I dealt with all 5 of those. So please do go watch those if any of those are of an interest to you. But with this one, we're going to take off right with number 6. And number 6 is going to be that the keto regimen is synonymous with ketoacidosis. Are you ready? Let's get after it. Ask any physician or healthcare provider about ketones and ketoacidosis, and to them they'll sound the same. What they're taught in school is that you either have no ketones or you have an excess of ketones. Doesn't seem to be any training that teaches them what's in between. Now, granted, that's changing now. Keto diet regimens, low carb regimens are changing that. Diabetic ketoacidosis is a life-threatening problem that affects people with diabetes. It occurs when the body breaks down fat so fast, produces so many ketones that they actually become acidic in the body. Okay, I want to show you another one real quick, another definition from Healthline. I thought this one was rather profound because it explained it very well. That diabetic ketoacidosis, DKA, is a complication of type 1. And actually, until I read this, I didn't even know of type 2 diabetes. I'd only ever heard of it with type 1 because they don't have a working pancreas. Type 2 diabetics do, and yet here, much less commonly, type 2 diabetics. Notice, if you and I are not diabetics, ketoacidosis is really not a concern. Right? We have a working pancreas that produces insulin, and insulin is the nemesis of ketoacidosis. Okay, so DKA happens when your blood sugar is very high and acidic substances called ketones build up. It's that combination of very high blood sugar and very high ketones, and I'll show you how high in just a minute. Notice, I love this, thank God Healthline is so reasonable. Paragraph 2, ketoacidosis shouldn't be confused with ketosis, which is harmless. Okay? As for the amount, let me show you. There's the graph. This was done by Dr. Finney. And you'll notice that in his estimation, any ketones, we're one place where Dr. Finney and I disagree. And you're allowed to disagree, right? That's a scientific method to question everything. Dr. Finney coined this term back in the 80s called nutritional ketosis. And he said that starts at about 0.5. Now, he has since, in a couple of lectures, recanted on that and said, I picked 0.5 arbitrarily. It could have been 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. Who cares? Right? The point is when you have detectable ketones, you are ketotic. You're in a state of ketosis. How did the ketones, if you have 0.2 or 0.3, how did they get there? Your liver produced them. You are therefore in ketosis. Right? I know that makes sense to you. However, he defined this level of 0.5 to 3 millimole as the state of optimal ketone levels of nutritional ketosis. Then there's this big gap from 3 up to near 10. But you'll notice that ketoacidosis begins up in the area of about 10. Hey, let me play a couple of clips for you by the man himself, by Dr. Finney. Check this one out first on diabetic ketoacidosis.
So physicians and most healthcare providers are taught that just the negative aspect of this, and that stems from what's called diabetic ketoacidosis, which occurs in what we used to call juvenile onset or type 1 diabetes, which are typically young people who through an autoimmune disease destroy their pancreas ability to produce insulin. They don't have enough insulin. The body has uncontrolled regulation of fuel metabolism that leads to very high levels of ketones, which are toxic and are life-threatening.
So just to put that in context, remember, if you and I are aiming for 1, if 1 millimole is our goal, 1 to 2, let's call it that, then we're somewhere in the area between 5 and 10 times away from the beginning of the possibility of ketoacidosis. So hey, God bless, go get yourself a Keto Mojo or a lifestyle, some kind of a Libre, one of those blood ketone meters, and keep an eye on it. If you ever see yourself approaching, I don't know, let's call it 7, it might be time to introduce carbs or to see your doctor. All right, one of those two to get it back under control. But again, if symptoms only begin at 10 and DKA only becomes life-threatening at 15, according to Dr. Finney, we really don't have anything to worry about. 2 quick topics just to finish off number 1 before I move on to myth number 2 in this video. Let's finish with 2 misconceptions about ketones. One is that you're automatically losing weight when you're in ketosis. That's a mistake. And number 2 is that higher ketones means something more. You know, Dr. Finney deals with both of these in a clip as well. Let me play this clip for you and we'll see what he says.
So there is a 2 misconceptions. One is the higher your ketones are, the better it is for you and the faster you lose weight. And there's a more basic misconception, and that is that if you're in nutritional ketosis, you are necessarily losing weight.
Okay, I don't get it. So you're telling me then, Dr. Finney, that 2 millimolar isn't better than 1 millimole?
But our participants are told if you're 0.5, you're good. If you're 1.0, that's probably better. Anything higher than that is just your personal biochemical signature and is not a sign of superior metabolic or physiological well-being.
Well, there you have it, right from, hey, Dr. Finney and Dr. Atkins are the 2 pioneers in this space going back to the 80s. So if Dr. Finney is of the opinion from clinical studies and clinical experience that 2 isn't better than 1, then I don't know about you, but my goal has always been to be in the 0.5 to 1 range, knowing as I do as a caveat that any ketones indicates ketosis, but the therapeutic benefits kick in, let's call it between 0.5 and 1, and beyond that, pure individualism. I think we beat that one to death. Okay, you good? Which means let's move on to number 2, and let's talk about keto strips, keto sticks, urine strips. Are they effective? Let's talk about them. There are currently 3 ways to test for the presence of ketones to tell if you're ketotic or not. By far the most economical is definitely using keto sticks or keto strips. They're urine strips that, well, let me just pull one out and show you in case you've never seen one before. This one happens to do both a combination of glucose and ketones on the same strip. So it can check for high levels of urinary sugar, as well as ketones in your urine. And so the idea behind it is you urinate on the stick or dip it in your urine and then compare it against the colors, the top row being glucose, the bottom row being ketones. Right? So that's what we're going to talk about right now. Very quickly though, there are 2 other methods of testing. One is a breath test, but the third one, by far the most well-regarded, the most scientific, if you will, is definitely using something like a Keto Mojo, which is a serum or a blood meter. It checks, in this case, the Keto Mojo does both serum glucose and serum ketones from a prick of blood. Let me start with a bit of background. The sticks are originally made for diabetics, and so that they can check for ketones in their urine. Right? Remember, diabetics, in particular type 1 diabetics, are worried about ketoacidosis. So to them, they're looking to check and see how many ketones are spilling in their urine as an indicator of whether or not they're in ketoacidosis. They have to be careful of that. Now, of course, back in the 70s and 80s, Dr. Finney and Dr. Atkins both realized that this works as well for people who are in ketosis. But only, and here's some caveats, only in the beginning. Let's talk about why that is.
We choose not to measure urinary ketones because the kidneys actively excrete ketones when they first appear in the bloodstream. And then over the course of weeks or months, the kidneys become conservative of ketones. Typically so you get this varying response where it's not linearly related to the level in the blood.
It's interesting that the body creates, I don't know if you know this or not, 3 kinds of ketones in our body. So I'll give you the 3 names: acetone, acetoacetate, and beta-hydroxybutyrate. So acetone, just so you know, is the one that we breathe out. So the breath meter tests for acetone. Urine strips test for acetoacetate. Acetoacetate is the ones that our kidneys grab out of our bloodstream before they have a chance to be converted by the liver into beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is our energy source, right? That's what we're looking for. That's what we're partial to in the keto space. Okay, so the kidneys actively, as Dr. Finney said, grab the acetoacetate and expel it, right? And now because of this proclivity that the kidneys have early on to pull all the acetoacetate they see and throw it into urine strips work great. And as he said, I found it right around a month. Right around a month in my 4th week, all of a sudden when I did something called getting keto adapted, which is another video which I'll also put down below. You need to understand what keto adaptation is. When I got keto adapted, all of a sudden my strips stopped working. So my recommendation to anybody is, in the beginning, if you don't want to spend the $150 on a good meter, a good serum meter, then by all means get the strips. Just know that they're only going to work for about 3, maybe 6 weeks max. Okay, and then they're no longer going to be acceptable. And the reason for that, as Dr. Finney said, is that the kidneys become sparing. When your body switches over to using BHB, beta-hydroxybutyrate, that ketone as a predominant fuel source, then all of a sudden your kidneys aren't stupid. They're like, why am I getting rid of this acetone, this acetoacetate that just by adding a hydrogen particle to, I can turn into BHB as energy. Right? So the kidneys, the body is so smart. Before I move on, let's just finish with one other topic about keto strips, about urine strips. And it has to do with the level of color that shows up when you urinate on them. So many variables. You need to know that so many variables can impact the color. So when I talk to people about how to use keto strips, I always say use them binary. Use them to say you're either in ketosis or not. Okay, don't worry about the depth of color. Any color for that matter. Any color is good color. Any color confirms, yay, you are ketotic. It gives no indication of how much BHB is in your bloodstream. Second, hydration plays a big role. If you are in any way, shape, or form dehydrated, which is tough to do nowadays, we're all drinking a ton of water, but still, it can indicate that those ketones have been in your bladder for a long time. Right? The longer they sit, the more concentrated they become. So water levels, the time in your bladder makes a big difference. So morning color. I mean, people who urinate in the morning on a keto strip always have better color than throughout the day because our hydration improves as we drink throughout the day. It just makes sense. And last is those keto strips are very susceptible to air, to oxygen, and to moisture. So what happens is they'll say right on the bottle, please use within 30 days. Right? Their efficacy diminishes quickly and to about 30 days in time once you crack the seal on them, which means that they become ineffective at determining level regardless, even if they were good. So all those things put together tells me to tell people, and my clients in particular, but anybody who I have this conversation with, is don't worry about the level of color. Any color is good color. If you've got color, you're in ketosis. Number 3 myth is that keto isn't sustainable. This one comes at us from all directions of anybody who's tried it and failed, and or anyone who's on a vegan, vegetarian, paleo. They'll often draw that correlation between people who drop out of any diet regimen and the fact that keto must therefore be unsustainable. I'm actually going to comment on this one in a bit more of a pragmatic way and say that I wish I could just outright call this a myth. I'm going to show you a couple of studies here in just a second that prove the adherence levels of certain diet regimens, of which keto, low carb, Atkins is included, and you'll see the numbers for yourselves. I will say this though, I do think that strict ketonians, those who follow the letter of the law, like to the T, to the nines, by the book, set themselves up to fail. It is very, very difficult. And I just did a video on refeeding, which I'll also link below, where I show that it's in our DNA, it's in our epigenetics, that we eat by the calendar, and that therefore at certain times of the year when we've gotten used to having apples in the fall or oranges in the winter or figs if you're from the Middle East in the spring, that we've always eaten by the calendar. As things became ripe, we gorged. And yet here we are as ketonians trying to fight that DNA and those genetics. So there are methodologies, I believe, like CKD, like cyclical keto, to improve adherence. But on its own, just strictly talking about adherence to a keto regimen, let's have a look at a couple. This PMC I'm going to start with, you'll see here it's called the Dietary Adherence and Weight Loss Success Among Overweight Women. In fact, what they did was I'll show you 181 overweight/obese women, and they participated in a 1-year trial. And the purpose of the trial was to help them lose weight, improve their insulin resistance, and they got paid. And the purpose of the study then was to do this, you'll see statistical comparison of 100% adherence over a 12-month diet regimen to see what their weight change would be like. So the purpose of the study was to compare weight loss regimens, diet regimens, if you will, of which Atkins/keto was one. Well, and remember, these are overweight women with heavy obesity, with high insulin resistance, and they're getting paid to contribute to the study, to be involved. However, I want you to notice, given the very low number of participants within each diet that were 100% adherent, we were unable to carry out this comparison across the diet regimens. I love that the authors put that in. That's very funny. I mean, it's not funny, but you know what I'm saying? It's that they had to admit they couldn't even do the comparison between the diet regimens because of the number of people who couldn't stick with it for a year despite getting paid. Across all 3 diet groups, only 1 participant in the orange group, which is an ultra-high carb group, met the criteria for absolute adherence. When they changed the absolute criteria, the adherence criteria, to 2 out of 3 post-randomization time points, then 9 people out of 181 qualified. Oh, that's dismal. The 12-month dropout rate, you'll see, was between 35 and 50% among the diets represented. It says 4 here, but there was 3. Okay, so I find that remarkable that in a year, in 12 months, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the participants couldn't stay the course despite wanting to, despite needing to, and despite getting paid. That's dismal. I'll show you another study. This one is in the Frontiers in Endocrinology. And the title of the study was Long-Term Effects of a Novel Continuous Remote Care Intervention, Including Nutritional Ketosis in Type 2 Diabetics. What they did here was very neat. They digitally monitored the participants in this study. They were hooked up to monitors, to meters that could tell them their glucose and their insulin. On top of that, they had education programs. They went in weekly for sessions, for accountability, for weigh-ins, for discussion, right? Oh, the power of being held accountable. It's so profound. What they had as well was 262 participants. Now, by the way, all participants had diabetes, type 2 diabetics. However, 262 were put into this constant care, this remote monitoring, and then another 87 just had usual care where they went in for quarterly checkups. They didn't have the education, they didn't have the accountability, the weigh-ins, and they didn't have that remote monitoring. However, what's most profound is what happened at 2-year mark. Notice 194 participants, or roughly 74%. 74% of the 262 were still enrolled in the CCI at 2 years. Guys, the takeaway from this, that accountability, that having a keto partner. So I'm going to put a link down below to a video I did on how to start any kind of a diet regimen. It doesn't have to be keto. It could be any calorie-restricted program. There's 8 steps, and one of them is accountability. Make sure you have someone that you can talk to, that you can share your concerns with or your thoughts with, but who can hold you accountable to the promises you make. Number 4 is that as a ketonian, our glucose can get so low that we become hypoglycemic. Now, this is particularly relevant. The times I hear this is when we're talking typically about other myths, like myth number 1 in the very first video, where I talked about how artificial sweeteners aren't at all a problem for us ketonians. That they're keto friendly, they're fasting friendly, because artificial sweeteners, and I refer to sucralose and aspartame, along with monk and erythritol and stevia, have no noticeable effect, 0, nominal at best, on both fasting glucose and on fasting insulin. And so always what comes up in argument is, okay, granted there's no calories, so there's not going to be an impact of glucose, but there is an impact, just taste, because of the sweetness, the taste, to insulin. And therefore, if you're fasting insulin, let's say mine's 70 milligram per deciliter, I'll use the old school, the American version, 70 milligram per deciliter, then if I have a sugar-free Monster, the fear is that the insulinic response from the sweetness of the sucralose could drive my fasted glucose down into hypoglycemic ranges, right? That the jolt of insulin in expectation of calories that don't show up could turn my 70 into a 40 or a 50. Now, actually, that never happens. That never happens because that's never been shown in any study on artificial sweeteners or non-cal sweeteners in ketonians and low carbers, ever. You can't find one. If you do, throw one in the comment below, and I'll gladly recant. All right, I'll give you credit for it even. Dr. Bickman brought this up, actually. Ben Bickman brought this up one time, and he said, it's really interesting that now that we're predominantly not glucose burners, predominantly now fat burners and ketone burners, what used to be hypoglycemic for a lot of people is immaterial now. We don't care. We don't care because we have so few cells in our body, like erythrocytes, or maybe a little bit of the brain, our kidney cells, men's testicles, testes. There are certain cells that do require glucose, but so few and far between, like a small minutia compared to what a carb burner needs. And so I'm going to illustrate that with this little clip from Dr. Finney. See what you think.
In a really, let's say, ethically questionable pair of experiments that were done back in the late 1960s, some physicians who were dealing with patients who were adapted to total starvation for a month, they plugged an intravenous line in and slowly infused insulin into them to drive their blood sugar down to levels that should cause coma or death in people who had levels of ketones in the 5 to 7 millimolar range. And as we say, kind of sarcastically, the only people in the room who had palpitations and sweating and anxiety were the physicians. The people who had the blood sugar levels that should be associated with coma or death were completely unfazed, had completely normal mentation, and there was no evidence of any perception of threat by their body's counter-regulatory system.
I had to go find the study. I mean, that is just too cool to pass up, right? So look at this. I found it. The Journal of Clinical Investigation. The title is Resistance to Symptomatic Insulin Reactions After Fasting. And as Dr. Finney said, what they do is they took these 9 obese subjects who all were hypoglycemic. Notice they manifested frank hypoglycemic reactions. Now, what I liked about it was they first got them in ketosis. Notice after fasting for 2 months, intermittent fasting, then administration of weight-adjusted doses of insulin produced identical maximum insulin concentrations and disappearing curves. What they did was they gave them first exactly what had caused them previously to have symptoms, right? And yet none. Then notice the next comment was glucose concentrations. Then they drove them further down. So as Dr. Finney said, they drove them right down to what would normally drive someone right through hypoglycemia, right into coma and potentially death. Glucose concentrations as low as 0.5 millimole. That's 9 milligrams per deciliter. And notice failed to precipitate hypoglycemic reactions. So the next time you see a conversation where someone says, I'm worried about low blood sugar, or, I'll tell you what the worst is. And take this with a grain of salt if you are a nurse. But nurses in forums, nurses in social media, because they see hypoglycemia every day and followers of a SAD, have a hard time making the switch to understanding our enhanced underlying metabolic state. Our context is very different from followers of a SAD. Our context is that we are not carb burners. So therefore, someone who was hypoglycemic at 35 or 40 milligrams per deciliter could be absolutely, have zero indication of an issue, much more below that, or in this case, down to 9 or 10 milligram per deciliter. We're going to finish up number 5 with the topic of muscle, and it's twofold. So I want to call this one the myth that keto costs you muscle, and I also want to deal with the myth that keto makes it much tougher to add muscle. So first on the muscle loss side, you may have heard the phrase that keto is muscle sparing. Okay, absolutely true. It is sparing, but you got to be careful of what the definition of the word sparing means. Sparing doesn't mean muscle proof. Okay, it's just like my watch. My watch isn't waterproof anymore, right? You never find that. It's now water resistant, meaning at some depth you will, I promise you, get water in your watch. Well, make no mistake. Yes, compared to a normal diet, absolutely, keto is muscle sparing. It is not muscle proof. Okay, you are in a long-term caloric deficit, you will lose muscle. Let me illustrate that. I found this really great article in Advances in Nutrition. Preserving Healthy Muscle During Weight Loss was the title, and it looked at it was a meta-analysis of a whole bunch of studies on weight loss. And notice the contribution in these studies, the contribution of fat-free mass loss, or fat-free meaning muscle loss, often exceeds 35%. I mean, let that sink in. 35% of you lose 10 pounds on the Ornish, on the Zone, on Weight Watchers, as much as 3.5 of it is muscle. I don't know about you. That's I can't tolerate that. We work way too hard for our muscle, and muscle equals metabolism. You cannot afford to give away. This is why when people rebound, they put the weight back on so fast, because they've so depressed their metabolism, they've given up muscle. That depresses your metabolism. Now, how do we avoid that, you ask? Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Notice the next section under strategies to prevent muscle loss. Regular physical exercise, especially resistance. Okay, so if you're not pushing against weight or pushing against resistance, it really isn't effective. Going for a walk, going for a bike ride, going for a swim, all good, very good conditioning exercises. They truly don't stop muscle loss. Okay, they're good for toning, if you will, and they're good for burning some extra calories, especially the afterburn effect for the next 24 hours. But to stop muscle loss requires resistance training. And second, notice a higher than normal protein intake. Now, it actually recommended here, I thought this was great of the authors, somewhere between 1.25 and 1.5 times the RDA for sedentary people, and at least 1.5 the RDA for those who exercise. Now, your next question better be, what is the RDA exactly? The RDA, so you know, is it's 0.8 grams per kilo of body weight. So 1.5 times the RDA, and so if it's 0.8 per kilogram, call it 0.4 grams per pound if you're in the US. 0.4, I mean, it's virtually nothing. It's very little. So they're recommending in this study at least 1.5. If you do part 1, which is regular activity, then you should be at least 1.5 times that. So for me, I go from 0.8 grams per kilogram, being in Canada, to 1.2. Now, I truly don't believe 1.2 grams per kilogram is enough. Right? That to me is not enough. I'm 80 kilograms times 1.2 is barely, what is that, 100 grams. To me, that's nowhere near enough, especially for someone who looks to not only save their muscle, but add a little bit. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition ran a great study of time-restricted feeding, which is another way of saying intermittent fasting, so IF, plus resistance training in active females. I'm just going to jump right to the results and for the sake of time. Notice the CD is your common diet. So they ate unrestricted whenever they wanted to. TRF being an 8-hour window from noon through 8, and then TRF with a supplement. They were trying to actually, the purpose of the study was to prove how effective HMB is as a supplement. So let's disregard section 3 and just focus on the control group versus the intermittent fasting group. On this graph, the sections that interest you and I are the middle two, fat mass and fat-free mass. Okay, we can talk about body mass as a total and body fat percentage, and you can look at those yourself. But what of interest to me is fat mass and fat-free mass. So when these women who were isocaloric, same calories, same amount of protein, just different eating windows, look at how profound the differences are. First, look at fat mass. If you look at the fat mass, you can see that the control group who ate spread out over the entire course of the day put on a couple 3 pounds of fat in the course of this 12-week study. But notice that the intermittent fasting group, they dropped what looks like about 2 pounds. I mean, that's profound because now look at the fat-free section. In the fat-free section, despite the fact they were isocaloric, both the control group and the intermittent fasting group put on the same amount of muscle. Looks like about 2 pounds. Call it 2.5 pounds, I think. So, is it possible, you ask, to not only drop weight, but also put on muscle simultaneously on a keto diet with a little bit extra protein? Because we're going to talk about that in just a second. By the way, I might as well just tell you now, these women were on 1.6 grams per kilo of body weight. Okay, 1.6, which is right around for you American folks, about 0.8 grams per pound. So these women were not shy on protein. Notice their previous habitual intakes were 1.1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram, but during this intervention period, the intake went to 1.6. So as we've established, if the RDA is 0.8, they didn't just do 150%, they went to double, they went to 200%. And 200% in a clinical environment resulted, as you can see here, in not only an increase in muscle, an increase in fat-free mass, but hey, protein burns, it's got a huge thermic effect, it burns a lot of calories. So can lose some weight at the same time. Isn't that what we're looking for? We're looking for body recomposition just like that. If that isn't your goal, well, I know it is. I know it is. Why else would you be keto except for body recomposition? Okay. On that note, folks, I hope you got some good information out of this. I hope you've made a decision that you'll incorporate a little bit of resistance training, as well as perhaps reconsider the amount of protein you take in. Don't go by the RDA. That's made for followers of a SAD diet, and it caters to the lowest common denominator. You know now where you need to be at a minimum 1.2 grams per kilo or 0.8 grams per pound, and according to the science, you can be a little bit higher even than that. On that note, I hope you got some good information. If you do know anybody who any of these myths apply to, who are talking about or believing incorrect things, please do share. Get them thinking in another direction. I do my best to be scientific, but at the same time, just get people thinking about other things, other options. They can decide what they want to steal and apply for themselves and or disregard. I'm good with that as well. On that note, please do share with anybody you know in social media or people you care about who are considering or on a keto regimen. Help them not to lose any muscle. But on that note, I'll see you in the next one. Ciao for now.